Today we will be covering the first two chapters of the book of Joel. The material in Joel continues picking up basically where Hosea has left off. We went through Hosea. We know Hosea means salvation. Ultimately, it's a reference to the salvation of Israel, God's plan of salvation for Israel. Well, the book of Job comes on the heels of the book of Hosea. The name Joel, remember, in the Hebrew, there is no J sound. It's a Y sound. So it would be more of Yoel, would be a closer pronunciation, or Yahweh would be the name that Joel would be, the phonetic sound in the Hebrew. The name literally means that Yah is God, or Yahweh, we say, is God. Again, is that the way to pronounce it? YH, WH, the Tetragrammaton. However, Yah, though, Yael, would be closer to probably the correct pronunciation of Joel. The name Joel means the same as the name Elijah. It's just backward. Elijah, El, Iyah, whereas Yael or Yoel. Joel means Yah is God. Elijah means God is Yahweh, or God is Yah. So it's just in reverse order, means the same. A major thrust of this book of Joel involves both reminding Israel and teaching all other nations that the God of Israel, Yah or Yahweh, is God. That's the focus. Again, the name ties right in with the primary focus. Due to the placement of this prophetic material as the second in the minor prophets subdivision of the prophets section of the Old Testament, it is most likely that Joel was a contemporary to the prophet Hosea, writing sometime between 790 and 740 BC. The principal theme, as I mentioned before, of the book of Joel is the day of the Lord. It's the primary theme, the day of the Lord. The day when all nations, the time when all nations learn who God is. Because today they don't know. I mean, for the President of the United States to stand up and say, we all worship the same God. Well, okay, the Christian world worships this one, and, we have different ideas of God in many of the pagan countries throughout the world. We have Islam. Well, Islam worships Allah, and that's the same God. Well, if you look at history, that's not the case whatsoever, because Allah is the masculized form of I can't remember, Alala or whatever, who was the goddess, the moon goddess, which many of the Arabic peoples worshipped at the time that Muhammad tried to bring together all of these various Arabian tribes, trying to bring them all together under one religion. And they were all extremely pagan. They worshipped every kind of god, multiple gods and goddesses. And so let's have one God. And so they chose to masculize Alaya, or whatever her name was, and they made it Allah. So that's the goddess, the moon goddess. That's who Islam worships. It's the reason the crescent on top of every mosque is there. It represents the moon goddess. Even Muhammad tried to see through, or saw through that, and tried to get Islam not to use that, or the Arab peoples to use that symbol, because it was so outright pagan. So the world does not know who God is today. The purpose of the day of the Lord is to bring people to the understanding of who exactly God is, and it is the God who revealed himself at Mount Sinai to Israel. Now, with that background, let's jump into chapter 1 of Joel and verse 1. Here we read, the word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. This prophecy begins by clearly identifying the source of the prophecy. The name of Joel's father, as it's given here, Pethuel, literally means the vision of God. The vision of God. The L on the end, of course, is God. So Pethuel, or the vision of God. The material recorded by Joel is composed of at least one vision. And there may be multiple, because we find as we go through this material in Joel that there seems to be overlays and some inset areas, and so there may have been more than one, but there's at least one vision. This is how God related the material that Joel records for us, was through a vision. Now, verses 2 through 4, as we go on, emphasize the mind-boggling destructiveness of the events contained or composing the day of the Lord. So we're going to read just a brief overview of how destructive the day of the Lord will be. In verse 2, "Hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers?" Or the New International translates that as forefathers, your ancestors. "Has anything ever happened like this before?" Concerning the prophecy that Joel is about to relate, he calls attention to the fact that there has never, at any point in time, been a calamity of this magnitude during the existence of the nation of Israel in particular. And going all the way back to the beginning of this present world or arrangement, and we're looking more at the time after the flood. Is there anything since nations have been developed that we're going to see of this mind-boggling destructiveness? This warning that we find here in verse 2 is very similar to the prophecy that was made in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, which was also referred to and given by Jesus Christ in the Olivet prophecy back in Matthew chapter 24. Remember in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, Daniel recorded that there will come a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until the time that it comes. So the beginning of the nations after the flood would have to be a reference because, let's face it, the flood was extremely destructive, and Peter correlates the flood to being just like the destructiveness of the fire at the end of the ages. So the flood wiped out all but 8 lives. And what is to come, the day of the Lord, is going to be very destructive, but not as destructive as that flood, which left only 8 people alive, because there will be tens, hundreds of millions who will survive the day of the Lord. But that means that there will be well over 5 billion who will not. That's how destructive. So not as destructive as the flood, but since the flood and the beginning of nations on this side of the flood, nothing like this has happened before. Now, Jesus referred to what Daniel wrote in chapter 12, verse 1 in the Olivet prophecy, and in particular, Matthew 24 and verse 21. He said, "For then there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world after Noah, until this time, and no nor ever shall be." Nothing like this will happen of this magnitude again. That is, on a worldwide scope. All right, verse 3 then. "Tell your children about it. Let your children tell their children, and their children another generation." God will require that every generation that follows the cataclysmic end-time events to be taught that what happens during the day of the Lord must never be forgotten. Remember to tell you, emphasize what had to happen during the day of the Lord. Don't let anyone ever forget, because nations drifted after the time of the deception in the Garden of Eden. They drifted and started worshiping things other than God, and even after the flood, very quickly after, in the days of Nimrod, we have a worldwide apostasy taking place, and men, once again, worshiping everything under the sun except the true God. And it takes the day of the Lord to finally emphasize God is God. The God who revealed himself to Israel is God. Don't ever forget that. So this is what he is saying. Verse 4, "What the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten." These locusts seem to be symbolic of the steps that will be taken to bring the state of famine among the nations. And this is one particular interpretation. God refers to the use. We go back to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 15, verse 3, as well as to Ezekiel, chapter 14, verse 21, we will find that God refers to the use of 4 forms of destruction or judgment. In order to bring about a total destructiveness, he will use 4 things. And he uses in both Jeremiah 15 and Ezekiel 14 4 specific items that bring about destruction. Since the purpose of the first 4 trumpet plagues is to bring about the destruction of 1/3 of the production of foodstuffs in the earth, in effect killing 1/3 of the human population, these locusts that are referenced here may symbolize those first 4 trumpet plagues. But I believe that verses 2 through 4, again, is giving us the staggering, mind-boggling destructiveness of the day of the Lord in its totality, because there's a change that takes place in verse 5. So he's giving us an overview of how destructive, and then he begins to relate specifics. And because of that, I believe that it is most likely that these 4 locusts symbolize the total desolation which the day of the Lord will bring upon all the nations of the earth. Those 4. Just as God used 4 types of punishment in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel, I think these 4 can be referenced or symbolized by what those say. Now, verses 5 through 15 describe the situation in the land of Israel leading up to the beginning of the day of the Lord. In verse 5, "Awake, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the new wine, for it has been cut off from your mouth." Since the focus of this prophecy is the day of the Lord, it is important to remember what group is generally viewed as being drunk during that period. And who is it that's drunk? According to Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, it is those who are associated with Babylon the Great. Notice here, Revelation 17 and verse 1. "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made,'" note, "drunk with the wine of her fornication." So the drunkards are those associated with Babylon. And the warning here in verse 5 is given to those who are part of the Babylonian system. Verse 6, "For a nation has come up against my land, strong and without number. His teeth are the teeth of a lion, and he has the fangs of a fierce lion." The nation that will occupy the land of Israel during the time leading up to the day of the Lord will be Babylon the Great, led by the beast mentioned in the book of Revelation. In Daniel 11 and verse 40, we read, "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him," that is the king of the north, "and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind," that is very quickly. He's going to come like a whirlwind, "with chariots, horsemen, and many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land." That part of the prophecy has not occurred yet. It is to occur, and it will be done by the king of the north, who is Babylon the Great. In Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 1, here Jeremiah writes, Jeremiah 6:1, "O you children of Benjamin, gather yourselves to flee from the midst of Jerusalem. Blow the trumpet in Tekoa, and set up a signal fire in Beth-Haccherem. For disaster appears out of the north, and great destruction." That's north of the land of Israel. Great destruction is to come from the north. Now, if we go back to the book of Daniel, chapter 7, I won't do that for time, but in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel lists for us the 4 great empires that were to rise on the earth, the last one, of course, being resurrected 7 times. But of those 4 beasts that are mentioned there, those 4 creatures, the first one was representative of Babylon. And what was it? It was a lion with the wings of an eagle. And so Babylon is associated with the lion. And here verse 6 is very specific that this nation that comes against his land, the land of Israel, is one pictured having the teeth and fangs of lions. So this is a reference again to Babylon the Great. Now God gives a further comparison of Babylon the Great to lions when we come to the book of Nahum later on as we go through the minor prophets division. In verse 7, he has laid waste my vine. That is, Babylon the Great, the beast, has laid waste my vine and ruined my fig tree. He has stripped it bare and thrown it away. Its branches are made white. Now, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 5 and verse 1, God represented Israel as his vineyard. Israel is the vineyard of God. And God foretold the destruction of that vineyard due to the failure of his nation to produce good fruit. Let's notice this in Isaiah 5 and verse 1. Now, let me sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved regarding his vineyard. Isaiah is the one who's going to sing the song. And he's speaking about God's vineyard. Let me sing a song about his vineyard. My well-beloved has a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. He dug it up and cleared out its stones, planted it with the choicest vine. He built a tower in its midst, and also made a winepress in it. So he expected it to bring forth good grapes. But it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge please between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done to my vineyard that I have not done in it? God is asking. What more could I do? God revealed himself to Israel. God made a covenant and promises to Israel. What more could I do? Why then, when I expected it to bring forth good grapes, why did it bring forth wild grapes? And now, please let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard, God says, because it hasn't produced the fruit. I will take away its hedge, and it shall be burned, and break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I'll take away all of its protection. I'll leave it wide open for those who want to pass through and take advantage of the people. It shall be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned or dug, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain on it. Now, that's the vineyard, but God also says, you ruined my fig tree. Now, back in the New Testament, the nation of Judah, Jesus Christ was giving a parable about the fact that the nation of Judah had not produced fruit. He came to the fig tree. And so the nation of Judah is symbolized by a fig tree. So he talks about the vine being all of Israel and the fig tree being the nation of Judah. And it would be stripped bare and thrown away. Verse 8 of Joel 1. The New International translates, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the husband of her youth. This is instruction, or this is detailing the state of mind of those who inhabited the land of Israel, who will inhabit it at the close of the age. Once the beast power subjugates the land of Israel, the Israelites who will be displaced by that invasion will be powerless to regain the land. They will only be able to grieve over their loss. And that's why he says, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the husband of her youth, because can't get it back. Cannot get it back and will not be able to retain or to regain the land. Verse 9, the grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests mourn who minister to the Lord. Now, since the sacrificial system will be reinstituted shortly before the land of Israel is conquered by Babylon the Great, offerings, according to the Levitical laws, will be made in the land of Israel. Daniel tells us that. Matter of fact, let's turn back to Daniel chapter 12 and note this. Daniel 12, verse 11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, better translated in the Jewish Publication Society translation as the continual burnt offering. At the time that the continual burnt offering is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now, this is information that God is relaying to Daniel through the angel. This is what is to be expected at the end of the age. And he says about the end of the age that the continual burnt offering will be taken away. Now, going on in the next verse, we find out that there's a blessing connected to 1,335 days, which seems to be 1,335 days before the return of Christ, the seventh trump, that there will be sacrifices that begin, and they will be cut off 45 days later at the beginning of the 1290. According again to what Daniel writes. But getting back here to Joel chapter 1 verse 9, once the land of Israel is taken, once the abomination that causes desolation takes over the land of Israel, the sacrificial system will be shut down, and it will not be allowed. It will not be allowed to continue. It's important to note here that the continual burnt offering, which was offered twice each day, once in the late part of the day, once in the early part of the day, that offering consisted of a lamb, and not only a lamb. You go back to Exodus chapter 29 and read what was to be included in the continual burnt offering twice a day: a lamb in the morning, a lamb in the evening. We also find that there was to be a drink offering associated with each one, and a grain offering. Now, very interesting, because here we are told that the grain offering and the drink offering have been cut off. Okay, doesn't mention the lamb, but when you have a drink and a grain offering together, the lamb was also included. So this is talking about removing the continual burnt offering, helping to substantiate even what Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 12, verses 11 and 12, that there will be sacrifices. You know, a lot of people have tried to say, no, there won't be any. But God says there will, because he connects a lot of end-time events to that offering. And we need to pay attention. Remember, prophecy. Prophecy is God-breathed. God spoke the words. It's not to be taken lightly. And there are people, as we come closer and closer to the end of the age, according to 2 Peter chapter 3, who'll be scoffers. Oh, where's the promise of his coming? You know, they could care less about prophecy. They challenge prophecy. They question prophecy. That's a warning that we're given. Nope, God says there will be sacrifices made. Make no mistake about it. Now, it also mentions here the house of the Lord. Now remember, the house of the Lord's a temple. The house of the Lord, prior to Solomon building a temple, was what? It was a tent. The tabernacle in the wilderness, that was the house of the Lord. And so it's not hard for the Jews, not the Jews, but the Levites among them, to put up a tent, a temporary tabernacle, in order at the close of the age. You know, there's still those who are waiting for a big temple to be built. I don't think that's going to happen, because this is something that's going to occur very suddenly, very quickly. Nothing on the scope of the kind of temple that was built in the days of Solomon, nor the refurbished temple in the days of Herod. All right, moving on to verse 10. The field is wasted, the land mourns. For the grain is ruined, the new wine is dried up, the oil fails. Be ashamed, you farmers, wail, you vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has perished. The vine is dried up, and the fig tree is withered. The pomegranate tree, the palm tree also, and the apple tree, all the trees of the field are withered. Surely joy has withered away from the sons of men. This passage describes the condition created when the army of the beast enters into the land of Israel. God refers to that army as the abomination that makes desolate. Remember that. Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verse 15. Therefore, when you see, Jesus says this, Jesus Christ the Savior makes this statement. When you see, speaking to his disciples, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Jesus read prophecy. He believed prophecy, and he tells his disciples at the end of the age, you better look into this. You better think about what Daniel says. spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. You better think about it, in other words. You're not going to understand if you don't think about it, you don't meditate on it. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That's what Jesus says. Now, that abomination of desolation is better described when we come to the book of Luke, chapter 21, verse 20. Luke 21, verse 20. Notice Jesus, again, the Olivet prophecy, according to Luke's account. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, the holy place is Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem, the holy place, surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. All right, so the armies of the beast will cause desolation. And that's exactly what Joel is describing back here in chapter 1, verses 10 through 12. Now, due to the destruction of their crops and the treatment that they will suffer under the rule of the beast, the Jews who are allowed to remain in the land of Israel during the beast reign, and there will be some who are allowed to remain. That's what it says, Zechariah chapter 14. Zechariah 14, verse 1. Well, he talks about the day of the Lord comes. In verse 2, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken or captured, the Tanakh translation better says. It will be captured and the houses plundered and the women violated, and half the city shall go forth into captivity. But, again from the Tanakh, but, he says, the rest of the population shall not be uprooted from the city. Half will be taken into captivity, and the rest, the other half, will be left. So 50% of the Jews in Jerusalem, in the city, the land of Israel, will be removed. And we'll come to this later on in chapter 3 of Joel. But the other half will still remain. And so the Jews who are allowed to remain, here again, back up in verse 12, surely joy has withered away from the sons of men. The joy here is the joy of the Jews, because they'll have no reason for rejoicing even though they're left in the land. Everything's been taken away from them. The land has been plundered. The city has been rifled. Verse 13 of Joel 1. Gird yourselves and lament, you priests. Speaking to Levitical priests at the close of the age, those who had been performing the sacrifices after the building of the altar. Lament, you priests, wail, you who minister before the altar. Come, lie all night in sackcloth, you who minister to my God. For the grain offering and the drink offering, again a reference to the continual burnt offering. The grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God because the beast stops it. You know, the continual burnt offering is shut down, according to Daniel 12:11. Now, once that continual burnt offering is stopped by the beast, it will not be restarted throughout the duration of the events leading up to and including the day of the Lord. It's not going to happen. And so, that being the case, with no duties to perform, the priesthood, here in verse 13, is directed to consider the plight of the land and assess what they could do. What action can they take to reverse the curse that's upon the land? Verse 14, consecrate a fast, or the complete Jewish Bible has here, proclaim a fast. Call a sacred assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land into the house of the Lord your God and cry out to the Lord. Now, into is inserted by the translators. It should better be gather the inhabitants, all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord. Not into, because you don't go into the tabernacle, only the Levitical priests. Now, the purpose of fasting, as we all know, is to draw closer to God in order to better understand what God desires of us. That's the reason for fasting, is to get closer to Him. What does He want us to do? The closer we get, the easier it is to understand. The priests are instructed here to initiate a movement among the Jews who are left in the land of Israel, a movement toward seeking God and repenting of their failure to live up to the claim of being God's chosen. Remember back in Isaiah chapter 10, God said, I'm going to send the Assyrian, representing the beast, against a hypocritical nation. They're hypocrites, God says, because they claim to be my chosen, but their actions, the example they have set, has been anything but my chosen. And so they need to reassess. Verse 15, alas for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as destruction from the Almighty. Now, what Joel writes here is almost identical to what Isaiah prophesied back in Isaiah chapter 13. In Isaiah 13 and verse 6, Isaiah wrote, wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. And skipping down to verse 9, notice Isaiah 13:9. I'll read this from the Tanakh translation. Lo, the day of the Lord is coming with pitiless fury and wrath, to make the earth a desolation, to wipe out the sinners upon it. It's to bring the world to repentance. And again, that's substantiated by what we read in the book of Revelation, chapters 9 and 16. Now, Jesus did reveal to the Apostle John that the day of the Lord will begin after the opening of the seventh seal. Compare Revelation 6:17, woe, the day is coming, who'll be able to stand. And then we come to chapter 8, and then the seventh seal is opened, and that's followed by the trumpet plagues. That's the day of the Lord. Now, beginning here in verse 16 and continuing through chapter 2, verse 20, is an overview of the day of the Lord, what to expect. It's just an overview, doesn't give us all the details. John, in the book of Revelation, puts it all together in a nice package by this outline form that John records. But here we're given an overview of what to expect. And again, most of the overview is from those who would be in the land of Israel. Although it is, as Isaiah wrote, it encompasses the entire earth. All sinners on the earth are going to be affected by this, all nations. So it's universal in scope. Verse 16, is not the food cut off from before our eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? The seed grain shrivels under the clods. Storehouses, or Tanakh translates, the granaries are in shambles. Barns are broken down, for the grain has withered. The remnant of the Jews in the land of Israel assess the destructive results of the coming beast power and the beginning of the day of the Lord. That's what's going on here. This is their assessment. Verse 18, how the beasts groan, or the New Revised Standard translates, how the animals groan. The herds of cattle are restless. The New American Standard has the herds of cattle wander aimlessly. They're looking for something to eat, because it goes on to say, because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep suffer your punishment, O Lord. To you I cry out, for fire has devoured the open pastures, and a flame has burned all the trees of the field. The grazing animals are denied green pastures due to the first of the 7 trumpet plagues. Remember Revelation chapter 8. Revelation 8 and verse 7. The first angel sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. So there's your pastures all burned up. Now, it does mention here in verse 19 that a flame has burned all the trees of the field. That is, those that are around the pastures, but not all trees, because Revelation clearly says that only a third of the trees are destroyed. Only a third. of the forests of the earth are destroyed. But those that are in close proximity to the pasture lands, according to what it says here, are destroyed. Now, again, Joel, well, hold your place there in Revelation 8. Joel 1, verse 20. The beasts of the field, or the complete Jewish Bible has, the wild animals also cry out to you. Not just the livestock, but all the wild beasts of the field also cry out to you, for the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the open pastures, or the Tanakh better translates, the pastures in the wilderness. So areas where the wild animals are, they also suffer, not just where the livestock is. In addition to the drying effect of the fire of the first trumpet plague, because if you send fire down to burn up all the pastures, you're going to burn, or you're going to cause to evaporate many of the ponds and the streams and whatever that feed that pasture land where the animals can go. And so when we have this first trumpet plague drying up many of the waters, the streams of water, and then on top of that we have the third trumpet plague, which will make 1/3 of the fresh waters poisonous, unusable. Because it shows us here in Revelation 8, verse 10, then the third angel sounded, a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. Skipping on down, and 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, or poisoned, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter or poisoned. So even the wild animals that are out in the wilderness areas are not going to have things to drink. They're not going to be able to drink and satisfy their thirst. All right, going on. That's just the first part. He's alluding here to the first 4 trumpet plagues in verses 18 through 20. Now we move on to something else that's part of the day of the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 1. Blow the trumpet. Complete Jewish Bible has blow the shofar, because that's what it's speaking of here, the ram's horn. The Tanakh simply translates it as the horn, a reference to the ram's horn. So blow the trumpet, the shofar, the horn, in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. So speaking definitely about the land of Israel here. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, for it is at hand. A day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like the morning clouds spread over the mountains. The focal point of the events of this trumpet will be in the land of Israel during the day of the Lord. In Zephaniah chapter 1. Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 14. The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. There the mighty men shall cry out. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high towers. So Zephaniah also refers to the day of the Lord as a time of darkness and desolation. Now, going on in verse 2, a people come, great and strong, the like of whom has never been, nor will there ever be any such after them, even for many successive generations. Please note, God does not state that there will never be another massive army like this, but that another massive army like this will not occur until after many successive generations have come and gone. Certainly, many successive generations will unfold during the millennium. Figuring 20 years per generation, you have almost 50 generations. That's many successive. Once the 1,000 years conclude, the millennial period of 1,000 years of Christ's reign, God will allow, according to prophecy in Revelation chapter 20, God will allow nations known collectively as Gog and Magog, to arm and come against Jerusalem. Notice this, Revelation 20, verse 7. Now, when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is, how? As the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. That's what's to happen after the 1,000 years. So when it says here in Joel chapter 2, verse 2, that there's not going to be anything like this again even for many successive generations, is what he means. Because after the 1,000 years, there will be another great group, a mass like the sand of the sea that comes down against the land of Israel. Now, according to the prophetic outline of end-time events, the combined armies of the nations that will oppose the Antichrist will assemble at the Euphrates River and will be unleashed against the beast power at the time of the sixth trumpet. Let's note this in Revelation chapter 9 and verse 13. Revelation 9:13. Then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, "Release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." So the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. Now that sounds like an impossible number. And so John adds, and I heard the number of them. He said, I'm not confused on this number. Yeah, it sounds like a lot, sounds logistically like an impossible number, but I heard that number. Guaranteed to be 20% of a billion. 200 million are assembled there. Now, we go back to Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 41. Jeremiah 50, verse 41, and we have a parallel prophecy here to what Revelation tells us, as well as what Joel writes about here in chapter 2, verse 2. Behold, Jeremiah 50, verse 41, behold, a people shall come from the north, that is, from north of the land of Israel. And a great nation and many kings shall be raised up from the ends of the earth. They shall hold the bow and the lance. They are cruel and shall not show mercy. Their voice shall roar like the sea. They shall ride on horses, set in array like a man for battle against you, O daughter of Babylon. The daughter of Babylon is Babylon the Great, the end-time beast power. So there will be a massive army that assembles and that will come down against the forces of the beast. Now, there will no doubt be some of that 200 million destroyed in this nuclear exchange that takes place after the sixth trumpet is blown, or what seems to be a nuclear exchange from what we can read and ascertain. But in spite of it, you kill off even 10% of 200 million, you still got 180 million. That's still a lot. That's a huge army. Never been an army assembled of that size ever. Verse 3, he describes what happens as this army moves down from the north. A fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, and behind them it's like a desolate wilderness. Surely nothing shall escape them. Once the sixth trumpet is blown, and a world war will begin. That's what happens. Six trumpets blown, a world war is unleashed, seemingly for a 1-hour period. The description of what happens in Revelation chapter 9, verses 17 through 19, indicates that it will be a nuclear war. It's hard to figure out any other way to apply what John describes for us. The missile exchange will last for 1 hour. It will end after 1 hour at the sounding of the seventh trump. Sounding of the seventh trump, and the event that occurs when that trumpet sounds, whether the world hears it or not, they're going to see something. The sign of the coming of the Son of Man will be visible to all. But at the seventh trump, the world is at war, because we're told in Revelation chapter 11 and in verse 18 that the nations are angry. They're fighting one another at the time that trumpet blows, and Jesus Christ, when it blows, they stop. There's something that's going to unify those armies. What remains of that massive army after this battle ensues and the battle stops, what remains of that army will move southward to engage the beast just before that seventh trumpet is sounded. Matter of fact, after the sixth trumpet sounds, that army is going to be on the move. It's going to be coming against the beast. And the only thing that stops it so that they unify and bring forces together is the seventh trump. We notice in Daniel chapter 11, verse 44, that it is the movement of that army at the Euphrates that pulls the beast and his forces out of the city of Jerusalem. Daniel 11:44, but news from the east and the north shall trouble him. That is the beast, the king of the north. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So the beast leaves Jerusalem. He goes to meet the armies from the north. Now, it does again talk about fire devouring, flames burning, and so on here in verse 3. Behind them, a desolate wilderness. Much of the reason why the day of the Lord is characterized as a day of clouds and darkness and gloominess is due to the volume of debris that will be thrust into the atmosphere of this earth in both the detonation of nuclear weapons and the fires that will burn in the aftermath of those weapons being unleashed. In addition to all of that, because every city, every major city of the earth is going to be destroyed according to many prophecies. But in addition to those sources of atmospheric pollution, according to a number of scriptures, one in Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 4 and 5, is volcanic activity. Major volcanic activity will occur. Look what happened with Mount St. Helens. One volcano, and when all of a sudden dozens, if not hundreds of volcanoes began unleashing. Because remember, the earth is going to be rocked to the foundations. And so it's going to be a time of thick darkness, as it says about the day of the Lord. Not just dark, but there's going to be substance to it. You know, all of this ash and the debris that's going to be thrown into the atmosphere. Going on in verse 4, their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like swift steeds or war horses, the New American Standard translates, so they run. Now Joel is attempting here to describe his vision of modern warfare with the only comparisons that he knew during his time. He'd never seen a tank before. He'd never seen an airplane before. He hadn't seen any of these things, and so he's trying to describe. And in his time, horses were the swiftest mode of travel known to man. There was nothing faster than a horse. And a chariot was pulled by a horse or multiple horses. And that was the fastest anybody knew. Hundreds of years after Joel, the prophet John, or the apostle John, who was also a prophet, recorded for us the book of Revelation. And John knew of nothing that could transport a man faster than a horse. He tells us in Revelation 9, verse 17, Revelation 9:17, And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. So he's talking about horses. And not much has changed. Today we want to talk about how many horses we got under the hood. Okay, everything is still measured in horsepower. So a horse represents speed. And so Joel is doing his best to talk about how quickly this army moves from the north. Verse 5, the complete Jewish Bible translates, with a rumble like that of chariots, they leap over the mountaintops. Jet planes shooting over. Like crackling flames devouring stubble, like a mighty horde in battle array. So Joel is now trying to describe the sounds of mechanized instruments of modern warfare. He's told us what he could see, tried to describe it the best he could. Now he's trying to describe what he heard. Planes, helicopters, tanks, flamethrowers, and all the other accoutrements of modern warfare. Verse 6, before them the people writhe in pain. All faces are drained of color. Those who realize they will be massacred by this massive army will be terrified. That's what he's saying here. They don't see any way to stop this. Verse 7, they run like mighty men, or the complete Jewish Bible has, like warriors, they charge. They climb the wall like men of war. Everyone marches in formation, and they do not break ranks. Highly trained military. No obstacle will be able to thwart their advance, is what he's saying here. They just continue to move. Verse 8, the New International has, they do not jostle each other. Each marches straight ahead. They plunge through defenses without breaking ranks. Due to the magnitude of the numbers of these armies, even large losses will have no impact, will not slow them down at all. They'll just keep advancing. They run to and fro in the city. They run on the wall. They climb into the houses. They enter at the windows like a thief. They will plunder and they will spoil the towns and cities they encounter as they make their southward advance. In verse 10, the earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness. The trembling of the heavens above is generally the sensation experienced when the earth shakes beneath. If you've been in an earthquake, you look up and it looks like things are moving up there too. It's just the ground under your feet is moving, giving that sensation. And it talks here about the stars and all diminishing their brightness. Well, the loss of the light of the heavenly bodies will be due to all of that debris that's collecting in the atmosphere, as we covered back in verse 3. Verse 11, New International has, the Lord thunders at the head of his army. God is at the head of his army, is what this is saying. We're describing the day of the Lord. Sixth trumpet is sounded, the seventh trumpet is sounded. His forces are beyond number. Now, that's a poor translation in the New International. The New King James better has here, his camp is very great. The camp of God, the camp of the Lord, who is at the head of his army, is very great. That is, great as far as the might and the power of those that he leads. Mighty are those who obey his command. The day of the Lord is great, it is dreadful, who can endure it? The army of Jesus Christ will be assembled in heaven after the first resurrection and the completion of the 7 bowl plagues. They'll be there for the marriage supper. And then the saints, after the marriage supper is over, after the 7 bowl plagues have been poured out, then all of the army of the saints will follow Jesus Christ into battle at the close of that 7th bowl plague. Revelation 19:14 tells us, and the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, follow him on white horses. So the Lord thunders at the head of his army. He's thundering on his white horse. He's being followed by the saints who are also riding angelic beings that have the appearance of horses. Verse 12, Now therefore, or the Tanakh says, yet even now, says the Lord, turn to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and with mourning. So rend your heart and not your garments. I'm not concerned about the physical. I'm concerned about the heart. I'm concerned about the spirit. That's where God's focus is, not the outward. It's what's on the inside. Rend your hearts. That's the statement that he makes. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and he relents from doing harm. This instruction in verses 12 and 13 is to the remnant of the Jews living in the land of Israel at the time of the end. Verse 14, who knows if he will turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. Notice a drink and a grain offering. Again, he's talking about the continual burnt offering, or making allusion to the continual burnt offering. When the Jews turn to God and finally acknowledge Jesus Christ as the Savior, and not until then, but when they do, they will at last realize the fulfillment of the continual burnt offering. They've got to turn and they've got to recognize Jesus Christ. Verse 15, blow the trumpet or the shofar, complete Jewish Bible, the horn in the Tanakh, in Zion. Consecrate a fast. Not only is the horn blown because of the war that's taking place north of Jerusalem, but it's blown to assemble the people together. A call to the people to assemble. Consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, or the Tanakh says, bring together the old, gather the children and nursing babes, let the bridegroom go out of his chamber and the bride from her dressing room. No matter what anyone is doing, no matter what age they are, bring them all together, is the command. Now, it's interesting that shortly after the seventh trumpet is blown, an earthquake will occur in the city of Jerusalem. That's what we're told in Revelation 13, or chapter 11, verse 13. There will be an earthquake. That earthquake will kill 7,000 men, it says. The repercussion of that will be what? All of the rest of the Jews and the Levites in Jerusalem will become afraid. They will see that as a sign, and they will turn and acknowledge God. That's what the Scripture says. Verse 17, Tanakh translates, between the portico and the altar, that is, between the porch and the altar, let the priests, the Lord's ministers, weep and say, "O spare your people, Lord." So apparently they will assemble together at that point after the seventh trumpet, and they will appeal to God because they're afraid, according to Revelation 11:13. "O spare your people, Lord, let not your possession become a mockery, to be taunted by nations. Let not the peoples say, where is their God?" In other words, come back. Come to us. Come to our aid. You see, the beast will leave. We already covered that, Daniel 11:44. The beast will leave Jerusalem, moving northward to meet the armies that oppose him after being released from the Euphrates River at the blowing of the sixth trumpet. The Levitical priests will then assemble the people together, because the army's gone. But they will be assembled together. And once assembled together, they will plead for God's mercy. Verse 18, then the Lord will be zealous for his people, for his land, and pity his people. So once he's called upon, at that point, he will be zealous. Zechariah chapter 12 describes for us what happens. Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 8. In that day, the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Again, the context of chapter 12 is the day of the Lord. So the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The one who is feeble among them in that day shall be like David. And the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord before them. It shall be in that day that I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. I will pour on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then, at that time, they will look on me whom they have pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn. In that day there shall be a great mourning in Jerusalem. Because God, looking back up to verse 7, we are told that the Lord also shall save the tents of Judah first. So God, after the seventh trumpet is blown, the first people he deals with will be the Jews. Verse 19, the Lord will answer. This is again Joel 2, verse 19. The Lord will answer and say to his people, behold, I will send you grain and new wine and oil, and you will be satisfied by them. I will no longer make you a reproach among the nations, but I will remove far from you the northern army. Better translated in the Tanakh translation as the northerner. The northerner. I will remove the northerner. The New Living Translation injects the armies from the north, and will drive him away into a barren and desolate land, with his face toward the eastern sea and his back toward the western sea. His stench will come up, his foul odor will rise, because he has done monstrous things. Now, both the army of the beast and the vast horde which will assemble at the Euphrates River prior to the sixth trumpet plague will enter the land of Israel from the north. And so when he talks about getting rid of the northerner, or the New Living Translation, the armies from the north, it means all of those who have invaded and trespassed upon his land. Therefore, the removal of the northerner can be and should be inclusive of both of those groups. Not only the beast and his armies, but also those who come initially to oppose him. The manner in which Jesus Christ will remove them from the land is through their slaughter in the Jezreel Valley. Approaching Jerusalem from the north, which is the way the army will come, according to what we read earlier, through the valley of Jezreel, because that's how it comes down, would situate an army. If it's coming through the valley of Jezreel, it would situate an army with the Mediterranean to the northwest, which would be to the back of the army, and toward the Dead Sea. If you're moving straight down the Jezreel Valley, you're going to have the Mediterranean to the back because of the way the coast goes, and you're headed toward the Dead Sea. You have to make a turn to the right, going toward the Dead Sea to come to Jerusalem. But they're not coming to Jerusalem. They're coming to meet the forces of the beast in the Jezreel Valley. And so the Dead Sea is going to be to the face as that army moves down. Now, at the time Christ leads the resurrected saints into battle, the two opposing armies will have united, as I mentioned before, in an attempt to prevent Christ from establishing his kingdom, because they're going to be, their minds are going to be totally given over to the power of the devil at the time. Their attempt, of course, will be utterly futile against the power of God. Revelation 19, verses 19 and 21. Revelation 19, verse 19. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies. So this is all of the armies of the world, gathered together to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. Then the beast was captured, with him the false prophet who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the rest were killed by the sword which proceeded from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. And so, again, that fulfills what Joel writes here in chapter 2, verse 20, says, "His stench will come up, his foul odor will rise because he has done monstrous things." That's what happens when a person is killed and the body begins to decompose. So that's how he gets rid of all of these armies that have trespassed on his land. Now, we come to verses 21 through 29, and we have here a description of the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. Let's note, verse 21, "Fear not, O land. Be glad and rejoice, for the Lord has done marvelous things." As in several other places in the prophets' division, God symbolically speaks to the land of Israel. The marvelous things will include healing the land and returning all of the descendants of the tribes of Israel back to the land of Israel. Those are the marvelous things that he's referring to. Notice in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 11, or let's start in verse 8. Ezekiel 36:8, "But you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel, for they are about to come." God is speaking to the land. Again, this is symbolic. "For indeed I am for you, and I will turn to you, and you shall be tilled and sown. I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, all of it. And the city shall be inhabited, and the ruins rebuilt. I will multiply upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and bear young. I will make you inhabited as in former times, and do better for you than at your beginnings. Then you shall know that I am the Lord." So God's going to do these marvelous things. Verse 22 of Joel 2, "Do not be afraid, you beasts of the field, for the open pastures are springing up, and the tree bears its fruit. The fig tree and the vine yield their strength." The desolation caused by the end-time plagues will be reversed. All of those curses will be turned in the opposite direction. The land will become productive, providing food for all, man and animal. Verse 23, "Be glad then, you children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given you the former rain faithfully, and he will cause the rain to come down for you, the former rain and the latter rain in the first month," or as at the first. The Revised English Bible translates the last phrase here, "the autumn and the spring rains, as of old," like it was when the land flowed with milk and honey. The former rain refers to the rains in the late autumn, which are essential in establishing the grain crop so that it can survive the winter. The latter rain refers to the early spring rains, which are crucial for developing the kernels in the heads of the grain stalks. Have to have that moisture in the early spring. And so basically God is saying here that Israel will never again be faced with famine or scarcity, as will happen during the time of the day of the Lord. Verse 24, "The threshing floors shall be full of wheat, and the vats shall overflow with new wine and oil. So I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the crawling locust, the consuming locust, and the chewing locust, my great army which I sent among you." That is the years of what happens at the close of the age. I'm going to reverse that. The curses that will befall the land of Israel at the close of the age will be replaced with blessings after the coming of the Messiah. Verse 26, "You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you, and my people shall never be put to shame." Here in Ezekiel 36, verse 12, Ezekiel 36:12, God speaking again to the land of Israel, "Yes, I will cause men to walk on you, my people Israel. They shall take possession of you, and you shall be their inheritance. No more shall you bereave them of their children." No more. They're going to die by being attacked on the soil. that makes up you, God speaking to the land. Verse 15, nor will I let you hear the taunts of the nations anymore, nor hear the reproach of the peoples anymore, nor shall you cause your nation to stumble anymore, says the Lord God. So he says his people will never be put to shame, and they won't. Verse 27, then you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God, and there is no other. My people shall never, complete Jewish Bible says, never again be put to shame. See, the presence of Jesus Christ in the land of Israel will be known by all nations. Now, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, they're going to all come up to the mountain of the house of the Lord. They're going to come up so that they can be taught by Him. Verse 28, it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. So after dealing, first of all, with the tribe of Judah at the time of the seventh trump, God then will begin dealing with the rest of the nation of Israel. Once He has dealt with the nation of Israel and brought all 12 tribes back to the land, God will then begin working spiritually with all nations, making the same proposition to the other nations that God has made to Israel. You could go to Ezekiel 36, verses 26 through 28. There, God promises Israel, I'm going to give you a new heart, and I'm going to put a new spirit within you. That's something that they don't have now, but they will have. He says, I'm going to cause you to walk according to my statutes, and you're going to keep my judgments. You're going to do them. You're going to obey my commandments because of this new heart, this new spirit that I'll put in you. That's what He's going to do for Israel, but He's going to do this for all the nations as well. He also made a promise to Israel in Jeremiah 31:31 that He would make a new covenant with them. Well, God hasn't made a covenant with the other nations yet. But when He does, it will be that covenant, not the Sinai covenant. It will be the covenant that God makes with Israel as the millennium begins. So He's going to do the same for all nations. He just begins with Israel. Verse 28, going on, your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. Now, prophesying is impossible without the presence of God's Spirit. That is, godly prophesying. There are things that are not, there are people who prophesy, but not by the Spirit of God. We're talking here about prophesying of God. And it's impossible without the presence of God's Spirit. Moses, remember back in Deuteronomy 11, verse 29, there Moses wished, when Joshua kind of got on his case, Moses said, look, Joshua, I wish that all of God's people could have God's Spirit and be prophets. That's what Moses wished. That was not the case. God also makes the statement in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 6, that He reveals Himself in visions and speaks in dreams. He shows Himself in visions and He speaks in dreams. And those are the avenues, he said, that He uses in establishing His prophets. So, your sons and daughters shall prophesy, old men shall dream dreams, young men see visions. That is, all are going to come to the knowledge of God. Verse 29, and also on my men servants and my maid servants I will pour out my Spirit in those days. What God is saying here is there is no class distinction with Him. All are equal in His sight. Even the poor and the servants will be offered God's grand gift. Now, the Apostle Peter quoted this section beginning here in verse 28 and ending at the midpoint of verse 32. He applied this passage to the coming of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, on the year in which Jesus Christ was crucified, resurrected, and ascended to the Father. The Spirit of God had never been given in the manner that it was given on that Day of Atonement. It had never been done like that prior to that time. And so Peter looked at what Joel said, and he saw people who had, these images of fire coming down upon them, like tongues of fire. And people heard the apostles as they spoke. They heard in their own language, miracles of hearing going on. These were things, again, that had never happened. And so Peter applied that. However, the focus of the prophecy here in Joel is millennial. It wasn't about that. What happened on the day of Pentecost when the New Testament church began was only a type of what is yet to be. All that Peter quoted and applied has not continued from then until now. I've never seen anybody have cloven tongues of fire come down on them when they were baptized. Okay, and had hands like, I haven't seen that happen. I haven't had anybody speaking in tongues, fortunately. Now, this verse 29, concludes the millennial discussion. Verse 30 begins a new section dealing with events pertinent to the day of the Lord. Verse 30, and I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. This is a summary of the sixth seal and the 7 trumpet plagues. Verse 31, then the sun shall be turned into darkness, the moon into blood before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. This is a clear reference to the events of the sixth seal, as recorded in Revelation 6, verses 12 through 14. Verse 32, and it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. This passage can be understood in several ways. The church which calls on the name of God will be physically saved from the horrors of the tribulation. We are promised that in Revelation chapter 3, verse 10. We are shown that in the prophecy in Revelation 12:14. There is a place where the woman is given refuge during that time that comes as trial on all the earth. So there is a promise that God has made to those who call on his name. Verse 32 goes on, indicating another possibility. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be deliverance, as the Lord has said, among the remnant whom the Lord calls. As indicated earlier, the Jews who survived the earthquake in Jerusalem after the 7th trump will be ready to turn to God. Revelation 11:13 tells us. And God will, according to Zechariah 12, 8 through 10 that we've read earlier, God will extend deliverance to them when they do call upon him. And so in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, there shall be deliverance for those Jews who do repent and turn to God. So that brings us to the close of chapter 2, and then we will pick up chapter 3 next time.